Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Beyond Reimagining Philadelphia Journalism. I am extremely excited to get us started in this panel, or really not a panel, a conversation with Dr. Shakti, who's going to walk us through radical imagination. This is a really, really exciting taste for us and how we can use radical imagination for us to really redesign what a Philadelphia journalism is. So I am really, really pumped. There's going to be a lot of time for us to work together, to see each other, and to really build together. So with all of that, I will get out of the way, and I'm really, really pleased to introduce to some and reintroduce to others Dr. Shakti.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm pumped too. I'm happy to be here. I want to say hello to all of you who I've met, but I haven't had the opportunity to see, and all of you who may be here for the first time. So let's get started, shall we? Next slide, please. So I want to talk before we launch into to everyone who is here, and for those of you who haven't been here before, is that we have a lot of journaling sort of interstitially placed in what we're doing. And I want to share with you that this journaling process is different from just writing down your notes. It is called Vimbas. It comes from Resmaa Menakem, who did My Grandmother's Hand, who helps us understand, along with many other people who deal with neuroscience, that the trauma that we have experienced that is both intergenerational and contemporary is lodged in the body. It requires a somatic understanding of the body, which is not necessarily connecting all the time with what we refer to as the prefrontal cortex, is really about us understanding what it means to heal. The body must be addressed. Now, we as a society, both culturally and in every other kind of way, have stayed away from this kind of thing because it gets us to this place that some people refer to as woo-woo or emotions or all those kinds of things. But we understand that the brain and its place, that the difference between the right and left hemisphere, which I won't go into today, but that it requires something different to be able to get at those emotions, which is often the driver for our behavior. Underneath the logic is an emotional pathway that is taking place all the time. So you've had a chance to look at the slide. These are all the different ways in which this kind of journaling helps us. And I'm not going to go through them. I just want to say to you that as you journal, where you can and as you can, take a moment to check in with how your body is doing and write that down. It is very important in terms of us being able to attend to social justice, is to be aware of who we are internally, who we are as a collective internal, and who we are externally, because from that flows what is shared in our communities that we live in. Next slide, please. So we are going to engage in conocimiento. And as I have explained in prior days, conocimiento comes from this practice, comes from the farm workers movement. It is all about social justice. It is about getting quiet, checking in with the body, but also having a conversation around what our strengths are. Because when we run into trouble, as we always do when we are engaged in making any kind of change, again, whether it's internal or external, it is our strength that carries us through. It's our ability to look at our rage and our fear, our ability to be able to cultivate and work from who we are on the inside in terms of our greatness, our innate human greatness, which needs to be aware. We need to be aware of what that is and how it works and how it can guide us when we are trying to bring forth wisdom. So just take a look at this picture. I don't know, Cheryl, if you want to try to click the little arrow to see if we can watch it flow, but I want you to just look at it for a minute And either the screen's going to move or it's not, but I want you to focus in on your breath. You are breathing. Your breath has a rhythm. It moves in and it moves out. You breathe in, you breathe out. And this happens every moment of your life. But sometimes we rarely pay attention to the breath. The breath is where we can go when we need to be anchored. The breath is where we can go if we want to engage in some type of mindfulness or meditation. But if you don't do that, it doesn't matter. You can still just look at the breath. Watch it now for just a couple of moments. I'll be silent. Watch the rhythm of your breath. When you breathe in, where does that breath go? When you breathe out, where does that go? So allow yourself to feel gratitude for your breath. It tirelessly is functioning on your behalf. Give thanks. Now I'm going to ask you to take some deep breaths. I'm going to ask you to exhale first. Breathe in deeply. Let your lungs expand. Hold it for a moment, and then just let go so that you relax. You bring your focus to the breath and you relax. Take a couple more deep breaths at your own pace. And then if you haven't done so already, just close your eyes for a moment and allow yourself to feel yourself on the inside. How are you? What is the temperature inside your body? What's the weather like inside? And just breathe. It is what it is. When you're ready, you can open your eyes and we'll go to the next slide. So I have a series of 3 questions for you. You may want to take a screenshot of this if you'd like to get back to it later, or write the question down. But I'd like you to ask yourself, when you have ever experienced a sense of freedom, you might refer to it as liberation. You may have been actually having an in-body experience of that, or it could be something that you dream about. What would freedom feel like? But remember first a time when you experience some sense of what freedom means to you, and write that down. You can do bullet points if you like. When have you experienced a sense of freedom? How do you long for freedom? Next slide, please. What does, or would it look, feel, and sound like, any of those, in your body? If you were experiencing freedom in this moment, what would that look like, or feel like, or sound like to you? It may come to you in the form of music. It may come to you in the form of movement. It may come to you through your thinking, your rational thinking, or it may come from someplace else. So capture that if you can. What does this freedom look, feel, and sound like in your body, in your mind? Can you imagine it? What would that be like? Next slide, please. And this is the last reflection for you. How might you define or describe freedom to others? It doesn't matter whether it's real or imagined. How would you describe it to others? If you met someone who arrived here from someplace else and you had to explain what freedom means to you, could you do that? What would you say? What would you express? So obviously, you can't really complete your answers to this question. This is like a takeaway gift for you to contemplate this. How will we ever move to freedom and co-liberation if we can't imagine what it might be like? And so this is another way to cultivate an awareness of strength, to be clear about what you're moving towards, what it means to you, how you express it, how you invite other people in. We're very good at critiquing in this society. We've been taught to do that really well. Our entire educational experience has critiquing embedded in it. And that's fine, but there's more. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is my dad, who you're looking at the left side. And I mentioned on day one that he was my first teacher and one of the best teachers I've ever had. And he used to say to me all the time, everything that is was once a dream. Now, this is a quantum physics statement that might not necessarily be understood, but I want to break it down for you and share a very quick story of how he would talk to me. This is an example of how he would talk to me, how he would teach me. I remember once he said, you know, people don't understand our relationship as human beings with the universe at large. And let's just assume that there's something that you're trying to create for yourself. And you have to work with energy in some way. You have to manage your own energy, but there's also energy all around us, right? Just like when you walk into a room and you know that something has happened and you weren't even there, but you can feel it, that energy. And he would say, let's imagine for a moment that you'd like a new pair of shoes. The average person goes, I want a new pair of shoes. And the universe gives a silent response in the form of yes. And then you say, but where am I going to get the money? And the response is yes, because creation is always just creating, right? He said, this is the way I want to invite you to think about it. I want a new pair of shoes. I want those shoes to be the most amazing shade of blue that you have ever seen. Now, of course, I didn't understand that he meant blue as it represents consciousness, but I learned that later. He said, and then you imagine yourself walking down the street one day and you see these amazing blue shoes in the window. And you go, oh my God, those are my shoes. And you go into the store and you ask the salesperson, and they bring them out in your size, and you look at them and they are beautiful. You try those shoes on, you slip your feet into those shoes and you go, oh my God, this feels so amazing on my foot. I walk in them right now and I feel like I'm walking on a cloud. They're beautiful. I take the shoes off and I smell them. I like the smell of new shoes, like the, interior of a car. And then I say, I'm going to get these shoes. I go up to the front. I pay the salesperson and I say to them, I'm going to wear my new shoes, put my old shoes in the bag. So I walk outside. I have on my new shoes. I feel like, oh my God, amazing. And I walk down the block and I run into my friend And she looks at me and she's go, girl, where did you get those shoes? Those shoes are amazing, and so on. Now, the whole time he's speaking to me in metaphor, but he's saying, if you can't dream it, if you can't envision it, you cannot create it. And this is where radical imagination comes in. We need to skip over all the reasons why not, and there are plenty, an abundance of them. All the structures and the systemic plays that happen in the history and, the culture and how our identities are formed and all of those things, which we talked about yesterday. But he gave me something else, and I'm sharing it with you. Everything that is was once a dream. Next slide, please. I think everybody pretty much has heard of Einstein, is supposedly, and according to all of the intel, quite a brilliant scientist, in many ways, beginning to bring forth quantum physics. And the story is that when he was 15, he had a question. And this question that he had actually became the foundation of the work that he did in developing EMC squared. And the question was, if I could ride my bike at the speed of light, what would I see? If I could ride my bike at the speed of light, what could I see? He's talking about radical imagination. But his rationale behind it is what's on this slide. A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. People experience their thoughts and their feelings as separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of our own consciousness. This delusion is a prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few who are closest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature and its beauty. This must be as much a part of our social justice analysis and the practices and the tools and the policies and the laws and all of those things that need to change. But there has to be an alignment between the deep internal nature of who we are and what it is that we're trying to create in the world. Next slide, please. So we are in this capacity called dreaming, limited at times by the social constructs that we have been taught, the boundaries that have become part of who we are, so much so that they invade our dreams. I mentioned yesterday, and I often talk about John Powell, who is a great, brilliant teacher. He is the one who created the whole concept. Well, I don't know that he created the concept, but he has promoted very much a lot of understanding about othering and belonging and what that has to do with bridging and breaking. He's quite amazing, and he's a professor of law. And one of the things that he has done in his law classes for as long as he's been teaching is to run them through a particular exercise. And now the majority of the people in his classes are white middle-class students. That demographic is changing, but that still is the majority of who he's teaching to. And so he would ask people in his class to do an assignment about whether or not you ever dream of being an animal, or you dream of being a part of nature, or you dream of flying or falling. And most people will say, yes, I've had those dreams. And then he would say, have you ever dreamt of being in a different body? As a white person, have you dreamt about being a Black person? Or has anybody who does identify as the female gender or cisgendered, have you ever thought of yourself inhabiting a different body? And often the answer was no. Now, why is that? Because even in our dreams, there is something about becoming other, particularly if you're not already in that marginalized lane. There's something about imagining, the capacity to imagine yourself in the position of other, that actually becomes a handicap. Because how are you going to work in the world around social justice if you can't imagine other perspectives and rationales other than your own? Here's another one. Andrew Harvey, a writer, who would ask his students, how much, and this is directed to white people, how much would you charge, or how much would you want to be paid to become Black? Or, and I'm going to say dark brown. We know people of color, we range all colors, you know. And, but to become that person who is visibly identifiable as other in this society, what would you pay? And for many people, there is no amount of money that they would take to change. Or the other thing that comes up, well, can I be Beyonce? Can I be some big basketball player or someone like that who makes a lot of money and has a lot of social capital? But beyond that, being able to imagine ourselves in each other's shoes is literally handicapped by the culture that we live in. So next slide, please. We want to talk about and be about radical imagination. For what purpose? For the purpose of equity building, or if you're using the term anti-racist, or whatever you're looking at, people who are marginalized in this society, equity, social movement that is moving us towards that, and the ability to dream. So we are going to be engaging in a process where you will be working in classrooms for quite some time. What I want to ask you is really, how do we create and proliferate a compelling vision of more relational ways of being, economies and ecologies that center humans and the natural world? How do we do that? Not just the accumulation of power over the material world, but first we imagine, we embody, we learn, we release the idea of failure and successes, because all of the data that we absorb, we can learn from. But a mistake is often a treasure, and we want to avoid the mistakes, but we need them. Or as my parents would say to me, you've got to be bad at something before you can be good. It is the imagination that can drive change. So to create a viable future, we have to be able to imagine positive, enticing visions of a future in which all of our understanding about fairness and access and well-being is actually coming to fruition. We must test drive our ideas within collaborative structures and gatherings. There are examples of how this new futurism is being made manifest all over the world. People are building what they call transition communities. So we have to use creativity, and particularly play, because play requires creativity. So we have to use creativity and play, and we can harness our activism and bring forth a future driven by an economy of well-being that rebalances power and wealth. We are out of, I meant health. We are out of balance, right? There's a futurist, her name is Grace Turtle, and she says, play is a political instrument. If we're making a political decision around how we want to exist in the world, then we need to think about the impossible. So imagination and play can inspire and open pathways to what may appear to be unknowable or unachievable. So we must do this. So before we launch into this, I'm going to invite you to just do a stand and stretch wherever you are. I know you've been taking in a lot of information today and the last couple of days. So just stand and stretch, reach the sky, move your body, twist from side to side. You know, whatever you do that kind of releases some of your energy. And I'll give you a minute to do this. So thank you. If you could please take your seats if you actually stood up. And we will go to the next slide. So before we begin, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'd like to invite you to close your eyes. And I'm going to read the question to you that's on the screen so you'll be able to see it again when you open your eyes. But I would like you to select in your mind a practice or a policy that you know must be changed in order to produce equitable shifts or changes within the field and for the public. And I'd like you to choose just one. One practice or policy that you believe must change in order to produce equitable shifts within the field and for the public. Now, once you have selected one thing, and this is just for play, it's for practice, so it doesn't have to be the perfect thing or the most thought out thing. It's really the first thing that jumps into your mind. I'm going to add on something here. I want you to see if you have something that you want to change inside yourself in order to accommodate your capacity for being in alignment with others and with yourself, of course, too. So you've got this capacity for both an external practice or policy or an internal practice or policy, even though the slide is referring to the outward gaze, I'm also including the inside gaze. I wish I could see you now because I would love to know if you have completed this task, but I'm going to move on. There's one more aspect of this. Whatever you wrote down, I'm going to ask you now to close your eyes again and imagine that it's already happened. This change that you're going to play with today as a part of your exercise. And this is just you all stepping your toe into the water of this, unless you've done it before, which in some ways I'm sure you have. But you have an internal quest and you have an external quest. So you'll be able to choose from one of them to do the exercise, and then you can try one of them on your own. So I'm assuming you've written something down that you've selected this practice or policy that has to change in order to produce change for both yourself and for the public. It'll be interesting for you to look back on this later and see the relationship, because that's what we're talking about here, forging relationships between your internal need to change, whatever it is that you need to heal, and the external work or the way in which the world needs to heal. So I'm going to share with you the instructions that are going to appear in the chat that will help you participate in what you're going to be doing in your breakout rooms. And when you get to your breakout rooms, you're going to need to select, you'll be in groups of 4, and you will need to select the following roles. One of you will need to be the facilitator to be sure that the conversation is moving on, that people aren't too long-winded, that you say what you have to say as succinctly as you can, but not so abbreviated that people can't understand you. One of you will need to be taking care of watching the time, and the time codes will also be in the chat box of what it is that you actually have to do. And the other two of you will be note takers so that you can take turns taking notes. Not one of you is saddled with taking notes the whole time, but also then you will need to be prepared to share something either in the chat box or, well, I guess it's in the chat box here because we can't really talk to each other. So you'll need to be prepared to share some bullet points in the chat box of what your experience was and where you got to. So once you get into the room, which is, again, the instructions will be there for you, the facilitator will begin by reading and will ask you to assume that it's 10 to 20 years into the future and to close your eyes and or turn your attention inward and let the idea that you've selected to work with kind of roll around inside your mind and in your body throughout your entire being. And you imagine that you, friends and colleagues, are getting together, that you have helped support viable change that has impacted journalism and the communities you serve, and that you've done such great work together and have accomplished some amazing cultural and structural shifts based upon your collective intentions that you shared years ago. And you'll be sitting back and talking about some of the ideas and barriers that you have, it says cultivated, but that's not really the right word, but some of the ideas that you've put forth and some of the barriers that you've had to overcome. And this is kind of like a celebratory conversation. It's a remember when conversation. Remember when we got together and we talked about making this particular change? Now, I've asked you all to choose your own changes that you want to make. It doesn't matter, because I think what you will find is that there is a commonality, just in the same way that systems and structures operate in some very common ways, that you will still be able to hear some of the amazing things that will get put into place when you actually bring forth your ideas into reality. So take 3 minutes right now to journal about your idea that you just named and some of the practices that are working, whatever that means to you. And my question to you is, what would be different? What are some of the norms that will have become part of the norm? What will you see and what will it mean? Most importantly, what overt or subtle changes have actually been made? And then the timekeeper will let everybody know when your 4 minutes are up. So you're going to do this in your classroom first, and then you'll follow the rest of the instructions. I hope I'm being clear. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and I will answer them as best I can. If I trust myself with the technology, I may come and visit some of the classrooms, but I'm not so sure. Cheryl told me I can do it, but I'm not so sure. So are you ready? Are you ready to move into your classrooms?
And in case you all didn't see it in the chat,
great.
click the breakout room section on the left-hand side of the screen, and there should be a room for you to join. Once you're in there, you can share audio and video in the upper right-hand corner of the video square that's on your screen. If you are not using Chrome or Firefox, you're going to have a tough go, so make sure you're in one of those two platforms. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Maddie Vasallo or Tiara Adriatico in the chat. Thanks, y'all. We'll see you all soon.
Oh, you're frozen. There you are.
Okay, cool. I know we have some people who are on the stage right now. So thank you all for accommodating and bearing with us during this period. Shakti is going to be walking us through some of the exercises here on stage. So if you had difficulty with the breakout rooms, no worries. She's going to walk us through some of that work together. I know some people are in breakout rooms, so we'll let them continue to do their thing there as well. But I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Shakti, who can walk us on the stage through a collective big breakout room working together via the chat.
Yeah, we'll do the best that we can. Just, I really was hoping that you have a flavor of what it means to engage in this kind of work. And it's really good when we're not in COVID and we can actually be together and do the work and gather each other's ideas. But in the meantime, again, thank you for your patience. I would like it if those of you who chose something external, someplace where you see policy needs to change or whatever you would be working on behalf of, and assuming that you were 10 to 20 years into the future, if you could just type into the chat box some of the things that you want to work on. We'll give you a minute or so to do that. And then if people have internal changes that they know they want to make, then we can type those in so we kind of get a sense of what people are focusing on. I'll be watching the chat box to see what comes in and writing it down. So listening internally. So I see one, the practice of listening within a news organization. Are there any others? Equitable funding of public education. So public education is the topic, with a focus on reading, writing, and comprehension, media literacy. That there are no more TV news crews who are covering neighborhoods without permission. So some control around what people get to report on, particularly if they don't understand the environment they're in, I'm assuming. Introducing the arts as a practice of critical thinking and imagining better. Awesome. Getting away from profitability as a mindset. So that's an economic change and transparency. Fair hiring practices. Moving away from assigned value solely based on capital. And intergenerational collaboration and respect for creative expression. Okay, I think we can stop there. If there are any others that are more directed towards some healing aspect of what you think you need to do for yourself or the community, or work on behalf of the community, you can add those in so we get a couple of those. More people of color and folks that represent the city, yes. So centering BIPOC. People in leadership. Or maybe it's even thinking about what leadership could look like. All right, so I don't see anything else coming into the chat. So now I'm going to ask you, I mean, here you really do have to use your imagination and play, because instead of being in a room with people, okay, making media more accessible. Okay, more trusting conversations. Now they're going fast. Healing. Okay. So wherever you are here in terms of what you've written down, and thank you so much for sharing some of your ideas. These are your passions. These are the things that you feel strongly. Now I'm going to ask you to take a few moments, take a few breaths, and you know what an elevator pitch is. You're on the elevator. You have named these things. We would have hopefully talked about what some of the barriers are, but even in not doing that, just imagining what it is that you're going for in terms of making change. Imagine yourself. It's 10 or 20 years into the future. You have gotten together with a bunch of other people who have the same passion that you do. Maybe even some people who don't, however that configuration plays out in your imagination. And you have actually made changes, big changes, because the status quo is different, because the cultural impact is different. The way people operate, communicate with one another is different. If it were 10 or 20 years into the future, and depending upon how old you are, I don't go past 10 for myself, but I'm sure plenty of you can do 20 or 30 years into the future, is that you can see that your work has taken root. It has become part of the norm. How would you know? What would be different? Please take a few minutes to write in your journal about the changes that you can imagine having taken place before we discuss the elevator pitch. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to just do a running list, a brain dump, as it were, of the things that you can imagine would be visibly, physically, emotionally, spiritually, whatever way you want to do it, different, that is now playing out in what is considered the norm. This is the way things are now. Write them down in your journal, and then we will talk about constructing an elevator pitch. What would be different? What would you see, hear, taste, smell, know, experience? So you have 1 more minute. Even if you ran out of ideas, I want you to take that minute to still imagine what would be different. How would you know How would you express to other people the changes that you have seen made that are now part of the culture that you live and work in the community, in your organization, inside yourself? What are some of the changes that you notice? Okay, so we can finish up this part. And I'm going to use, Sean, the example that you put in, which is the last thing in my chat box, which is equitable representation of the types of stories told about BIPOC communities. So if that were actually happening, Sean, how would you know? What would the expression of these stories that have happened over years, what kind of changes would they have made? Who would be impacted? How would perceptions have shifted? How would that impact the ability for people to listen more carefully to people who have experiences other than their own? This is what I'm asking you all to think about now within the topic that you put down. A multiplicity of diverse bylines, broad changes in media ownership, rich and creative media in all forms. Jim, what would that look like? What would be the byproduct of that happening? How would it change society? How would it change culture? TR, the same thing for you. I'm just reading backwards now. Healing, focusing on giving oneself authority to take up space. So you've taken up space. It's been going on for 10, 20, 30 years. And what has shifted? Do you still have to take up space, or are people more willing to listen? And what would that mean? So these are the things that I would like every one of you to write down in your journal, like specifically, now that these things have happened, what else do you see? So we've moved beyond naming that this needs to be done. It's been done. And what does that mean? So I'm going to give you another minute or so to add on to what you have already written in your journal. For you, Roxanne, I have to say something because I really love what you put down. Externally moving away from assigning value solely based on capital. There are governments that are doing that now. And what is the repercussion of that, do you think? What will happen when we evaluate not just on our budgetary accomplishments as a nation, but how we are as people? What would people, does this have anything to do with liberation? If you were here this morning earlier, does it tie into how you imagined what liberation would look like, freedom would look like? Does it fall into that category? So now, I know that you're not finishing anything. So please know that I understand that this is playing. We are playing with imagination. We need to be able to play. It is a skill that is being lost. And I'm not going to go into that rant, but so I want you to imagine for a moment that you are somewhere and you are on the imaginary elevator, and you run into someone who you haven't seen for a while, and they ask you how you're doing. And you are like, this is 10, 20 years into the future. You are, I've been working on this project for years with people, and this is what I'm noticing right now. And you have 2 minutes to tell them because you're going to get to your floor, probably even before 2 minutes. How do you condense down this image of what you see, this vision that you're now holding, needs to be expressed in current time about what you're seeing into the future. What kinds of things might you say? So look at what you've written and see if there's something else that you want to add on. How would you express this to other people about how grateful you are, how you've worked and what that has meant and how fulfilling it is for you and where it's taking us and so on and so forth. Yeah, thanks, Anne. So there's some kind of, Anne, in what you just wrote, there's some kind of policy change here, and some of it may have been something that's been put forth in other countries right now, or some people are putting it forth in the United States, but name what that is. How would it come to be that journalists don't have to worry about paying the bills? How would that be true for everybody? What would there, I mean, these are fundamental paradigm shifts that you're talking about here. It's a beautiful thing. So I do apologize that we've had to do this way. It's so meaningful when we can do it in small groups of people and really bounce off of each other and the ideas that we come up with and the energy that creates. It is 12:59. People are going to be coming back in 1 minute. And I'm going to be repeating some of this, but I'm also going to be inviting people to scan what has been put in the chat box and that they can add to it. So hang in for a few minutes while we get them caught up. Yeah, thanks, Cheryl. So do let me know when people have come back in from their breakout rooms and we can see what they will be adding to this conversation. Okay, so everybody's back. That's great. And welcome back, everybody. I would like you to take a look at the chat box and to kind of scan what it is that's been chat box with other people sharing their ideas about what they would see changed 10, 20 years. Those of you who are young can do 30 years from now, and see if there's anything that you'd like to add. It can be an internal process that you know that you want to work on that becomes a collective internalized experience, or it could be, meaning lots of people are having that experience now, or it could be external policy change, responses, so on and so forth. So if there's anything that you feel you want to add here, please feel free. So Roxanne, why is this making you think about June Jordan and bell hooks? Would you mind typing a response to me? I love what you wrote, Jim, also. Hustle for joy. Love that. So I'm not seeing any new additions into the chat box right now, but don't feel free if something comes up for you and you want to type it down. I'm watching. So what we talked about was being able to really look ahead and in assuming that these things that you have been working on for years with other people really have actually taken hold in the culture of this society, in the practices in this society, in the ways that we relate to one another in this society, the authenticity of the quality of those relationships, and so on and so on and so on. If you were getting on an elevator and you ran into somebody that you haven't seen for a while, and they ask you, how are you doing? You could talk about how happy you are about this work that you've been engaged in for so many years, because this is what you see are the repercussions of the changes that have happened. What do you notice? It could be a small little detail of something that you notice that's different within your family. It could be something that is a way that people are seeing each other, whatever it is. There are, if it's in education, what are the changes in education that you actually see going on? What are children experiencing? How is joy being communicated out into the world? What does it mean to take care of injustice in the world? Prison reform, whatever it might be. I want some tangible examples in the chat box of how you know for sure that all this work that you've done has really been worthwhile. And you are so grateful that you've had an opportunity to be part of the change that this society so desperately needs. What do you see? So start typing some of those very specific things in the chat box right now. Sounds like we're part of the community as opposed to just viewing the community as an outsider. The understanding that joy and struggle can coexist and that our liberation is tied to the collective. Give me a tangible example of that. Your own story that you can make up. I used to have this experience all the time, or kids would have these experiences, or people in my community would have these experiences, and now they have that. What are the examples? As specific as you can be. What would arts as a core media look like? How would that be playing out? Where? When? Publicly? Within education? Where? And give me a small example. So Morgan, I would love to hear more about your holistic practice of critical thinking and imagining futures that are accessible and taught to all. What would the byproduct of that be? So it's been operationalized, but there's a byproduct that comes from that. What is this? And I'm going to tell you in a few minutes why this is such an important part of the process. In 20 years, 25% of my Temple media students come from the neighborhoods around Temple, 25% from other neighborhoods, POC, differently abled people, students from Camden, Norristown. In other words, that my Temple students reflect the Philly region. Then those students graduate and are hired as reporter, journalists, and media makers at the Inquirer. And why? Yes, why? So tell us why. What do they bring that is not popularized right now? What do they bring collectively, individually? Yes. that people truly get to see. Is there an element of education or questioning that you bring out to the world to consider so that we're forced to go deeper, get to the roots of why we are needing to make these changes? Why our public radio station is what Clemencia wrote. They bring the local perspective and they understand the community that they serve. Yes. So I know I'm talking while you're writing. I saw something on TV just the other day that was a demonstration, and the cameras were looping, and what I saw consistently was this one Black guy who was getting arrested. Now somebody cut that in the editing room, but how does that fortify the belief systems that we have now? And could that change? Yes, people bring local perspective and they understand the community they serve. Absolutely. Teaching media practice in journalism schools would be required. What about the understanding of the big systems that we're living inside of? Exactly. So see, you guys are having a conversation here, Crystal and Clemencia and Krista and Vanessa. Yes. Oh, I didn't see this one. Project Row House, the artist project that houses young mothers to go back to school and provides childcare. It is not what people would think of as an art project, but it is. And when you reframe the arts as more than drawing and painting. So how might that be made? How might that have become popularized? Where do people see evidence of this? You know, how would it affect billboards or television programs or whatever? How would it become popularized? What kind of hidden talents will be discovered? How will children be taught to think creatively? So on and so on and so on. So you can keep adding things to the chat box. And I actually am going to ask us to move to the next slide, Cheryl. Community members are sharing news from their neighborhoods, are valued for their contributions. They are connecting. Whoops, I lost it. They're connecting with each other, storytellers in other cities. Yes, in the United States and internationally, opportunity is supported. Television news would be multilingual and accessible. And what would that mean? What would that produce? That's the next step that we have to take in our visioning. We have the vision, but what does that accomplish? Once it becomes operationalized, what do you see? And I might even add, not what do you see, what do you feel? What do you know? What kind of wisdom? Is there a wisdom that reconnects us? Are we connected to the earth? Yes, evidence of change, major evolution in who owns and controls media. Yes. And what does that have to do with profit? Some of you mentioned that. Support the builders of equitable organizations. And what are they doing? What are you looking for? This is an endless process of both making it bigger and refining, bigger and refining. It's like a dance. So I want to point out to you that radical imagination is a tool for decolonization, that it is about reclaiming our rights to be who we are meant to be and to shape our lived reality. I want you to recognize, for those of you who were here earlier, that this is the part of definition of what it means to create belonging. We have a right to inform and shape our lived reality via the policies and rules and regulations and customs, and that's the way it's always been, to shifting the structures and how they operate, to understanding who we are and what we bring when we are able to align ourselves with the greatest parts of who we are as human beings. So here's my question for you. Can we envision together what it would be like if the world was working. That's basically what I've been asking you. What if people living into a global future embodied social decency, equity, community involvement, empowerment, and felt good about just being alive? We talked about breathing and being grateful that we are alive, and it goes, of course, beyond that. But we have the basic support to live, which is the breath. Without the breath, we have nothing. By focusing on building socially just and resilient economies from the ground up, rather than a continued submission to extractivist business models, we take this time to ask ourselves, what would the world be like if we actually transitioned into a healthy place? Can you imagine that? Can you practice this enough to imagine that that's taken place? Look at this nonsense that's going on in the world about the election. You know, this is the last breath of the dying dragon. Change must happen. It will happen. This is a step along the way. It's an evolutionary perspective that speaks to transitioning from the world as we know it in ways that are already fueled by a true evolution of consciousness. By focusing on building socially just and resilient economies from the ground up, something magical can happen, and we can play very differently. So this is an evolutionary perspective that we're playing with here that speaks to transforming the world. Next slide, please. I want to talk just a very short minute here about the darkness. You know, this fear that has been put forth about the darkness and dark people. There is a luminescent quality, a healing quality, the process that we go through to birth children into the world. This darkness has illuminating light inside of it, but we have to feel our way through. This is another reason why it's so important for us to work with emotions. How do our triggers, our traumatic triggers, get in the way of us doing good work and being liberated? This is in addition to the structures that are in us and around us. How does learning how to deal with our anger and our fear become such a huge part of healing, but also a huge part of justice? How do we begin to really explore the connections that exist in absolutely everything? We are connected. Next slide, please. One of the resources that I mentioned comes from a book that I found on my bookshelf. I think I mentioned this on day one. The book looks like this, and it is News for All People, The Epic Story of Race and the American Media. If you do not have this book as a journalist, it's very important for you to not only have it and read it, but to understand what it's saying in the light of the systems that we live in light of the structures that are created to prop that system up. And do we believe that systems can be changed? That's another conversation. But I must say that we must need to know the history, because these patterns have looped through and continue to perpetuate themselves over and over and over and over and over again. And Anthony Smith, who is quoted in the book, which is written by Juan Gonzalez and Joseph Torres, the ways in which information passes through a society are the key to that society's culture and are inseparable from its understanding of how to preserve itself and internal relationships. It is the silences that control a society to keep it stable, much more than the conscious noise it generates. And I would also say the unconscious noise that it generates. So we're near the end. I have a final story that I want to share with you just to say goodbye. but we have a few more minutes, and I'm wondering if anyone has any questions or comments that you would like to place in the chat box right now. How are you doing? What does this open up for you, if anything? How will you continue to practice? How will you cultivate this very important way of looking ahead and constantly checking ahead into the future to where you are now, and figure out what are the barriers that need to be addressed, whether they're internal or external, to have your ideas become not only actualized, but operationalized. So any comments that you have right now, just to bring this session to a close, or questions? Yes. I don't know that I have answers, but I love dreaming with people. So while I'm waiting to see if anything shows up, the other thing that I would want to put forth is really looking at what does it mean for us to grow? What does it mean for us to grow? And how do we do that? Yes, I love your question too, Cheryl. It's a great question. We have to let go of the traditional exclusionary way of doing things. We need to abandon old behaviors, unlearn things, and be open to undergoing a rebirth and evolution around issues of power and empathy. And I would add to that, Vanessa, that we need to have a rebirth around healing. You know what, Jim, thank you for your question. I don't know what kind of advice I have. I feel like, you know, I don't really know your world, and I don't know how long COVID is going to last. But I think that when people come together, even if it's on Zoom, even if it's in small groups, to have these conversations that take an issue, project it into the future, and then look at how for it to become something that is popularized, embodied, you know, a way to be. Meaning, we have to become able to talk about the benefits of what we're proposing to other people. We have to be able to talk about why it will change your life in a way that's good, but we also have to do a lot of listening. So whatever ways you can convene, Jim, I think, in terms of what it means to practice dreaming and playing together is a very important piece of this. Yes, engage with youth. They are the future writers, journalists, media makers investing in education. Still very little, unless you're into something like restorative justice, and really looking at forgiveness as an issue and really understanding what that means. That is a place where we need to do a tremendous amount of work as a society. And this is decolonization, understanding indigenous ways of knowing and being that are connected becomes very important. Okay, so I think we're done. Being told by Hoppin that the quota has been exceeded and people can no longer get the feed. So I'm going to say goodbye to all of you then. And can you give me the last slide, Cheryl, for those of us who might be able to hear? So I want to just say something about this picture, which is an article that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle in 2016 or 17. But this whale was seen off the Golden Gate Bridge and was drowning. And someone called the people that and they came in and sent in a team of divers to cut the ropes. And And the whale, when she was freed, kind of swam around and bumped every diver as if to say thank you. But this single diver that you see here that was cutting the ropes from the mouths of the whale, she tracked him the entire time, and he said his life would never be the same. We need each other. We need each other to do the work that we need to do. It can't be done alone. And so I want to thank you. Thank you for the thank yous that are coming in, but I want to thank you for bearing with some of the technological difficulties, but also in being engaged in ways is what I really long for, is for us to be connected to one another in ways that actually can allow us to make change in the world that needs to happen. So I wish you all well. Have a good rest of your year and stay safe and take care of yourself and one another. So thanks so much for inviting me to be with you all.
Well, Dr. Shakti, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, your wisdom with us. I know you come from outside of journalism, but I think sometimes we can learn so much from hearing from people in different industries and who come from different backgrounds. So thank you so much. Everybody, thank you all so much, as Dr. Shakti said, for engaging with this process up until this point. We have one more session left, and it is a good one, Reclaiming Our Stories, which is really focusing on Black storytellers, how they've been sharing information in this time and filling the gaps that we've been talking about. So we know, although a lot of mainstream outlets have not been filling these gaps, that our communities have stepped in. And so they're going to be talking about what lessons we can derive from that work. And I know we've all been sharing our radical imaginations within the chat, but I would like us to end just with the closing part of the Presente documentary of what are the hopes that our community members have for us in terms of journalism before we close out. So I'm going to share that now. And then after that, you all can feel free to grab a snack and hopefully come join us at 5 p.m. for that session.
The truth. And the truth is the most competent, culturally competent way possible.
Cuando redactan un artículo, ponen cosas como para que el lector se interese más o le den la curiosidad. Entiendo esa parte, pero si no dicen en verdad lo que es o la verdad como es, pues se distorsiona.
Follow the story to the end. You know what I mean? Don't sugarcoat it. Let people figure it out for their own.
Media just has to get better. I mean, I just would like to just see them really be honest and truthful and look at all the different sides, because there are many sides to a situation or story that you see.
I would love to see media and journalists share more of the success stories of young people and like share more about when someone like Mai or someone like young people who have been through the system and like despite all of that have been able to do positive things and to support other young people.
And my parents like had more like information where as though they can read it in their language. They would like have more information, know what's going on and something like that. Like it would be helpful just to have other like languages.
Ahorita ya hay más información en inglés y en español, pero sería más bueno que hubiera información hispana. A todos los periódicos locales también sería bueno que pusieran algo de salud, a dónde puede ir si está enfermo.
At some point in time, as journalists, we can make somebody's life that much better, or shine a light onto a situation that helps others to help others. Inspire. That's what I would say. Inspire.